about grieving and illness. I know it maybe sound like a kind of a downer, but we're going to talk about how you can cope with it, best ways to do that, find community and other things. We're going to do that with O'Connor Mortuary's Becky Lomaka. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So we're having the subject of basically grieving and illness, which are things that are realities, folks. And what are some of the truths that we have about grief in general? What are some of the things we know that in terms of dealing with it?
Well, grief in general, we know that it's very individualized. How I grieve is going to be very different from how you grieve. We might have a few similarities, yet I think people want a path on how they should do it right. And the reality is it's very individualized, and we grieve a lot like we live. And it's really not anything that we're looking to find closure, because a little bit of us will always be feeling that tinge of grief, yet grief does change over time. And the good news is, for the vast majority of us, it does get better, and those really hard days are fewer and fewer.
Now, you say everybody's different, they have their different approaches, but there are some things that people, when they maybe try to avoid the grief, and that can be a definite challenge, right? Where it's like, I don't want to go through this, I don't want to deal with that, and that's one of the things we say that's the wrong way to maybe handle it, right?
Well, and it seems a little counterintuitive, right? Because I'm not going to think about this, I'm going to move on, I'm going to forget about this, and that is going to help me feel better. And what we find is it's actually just the opposite. When we allow ourselves to actually feel these feelings and acknowledge our pain that we're feeling because of this loss, it actually helps us to move forward in our grief.
Yeah, and a sense of loss is a real thing. You've lost something in that world, right? And so when that's taken away, it's a normal. Even people lose jobs, and we don't even talk about death. Lose jobs, lose a relationship, lose all these things. There's a transition that goes on that you have to adjust to.
Absolutely, we have to learn to adapt, and really that's when we talk about grieving and illness, that's what that's about. There's something called anticipatory grief, and just like it sounds, it's grieving something that will happen. So it's grieving preceding a death loss. Yet when we think about grieving illness, it is grief that we're experiencing. There are a lot of losses. It may not be a death loss that we're experiencing, but as you said, loss of our roles, right? Loss of our abilities to do certain things, loss of the ability to have the same social connections that we had before. So all of those things are grief.
And do you find sometimes, people kind of maybe get through that process and then it reemerges as well? Like I know this may be silly, but I lost a pet recently, and something hit me the other day, and I was like, oh, poor Tina, and I just I got emotional over it again, a little bit more than I expected to.
Absolutely. I had a very similar experience. We had our dog of 12 years die about a year ago, and just a couple of days ago, I was in the kitchen, I opened up the fridge, and my automatic reaction was to turn around to see if she needed water in her water bowl, and I just, a few tears just trickled down. Now, it's been over a year since she died, but those little things, and that's the thing about grief, is that's why we don't talk about closure. It never truly goes away. Now, am I functioning? Am I happy? Am I living a healthy life? Absolutely. But I had that moment where, that particular act just brought her right back to me.
Now, when we talked about anticipatory grief, you mentioned before, it seems to me, maybe some people would say, oh, why are you worrying about that? Why are you worrying about that? Like, don't do that. Is there a healthy way in terms of, and maybe an unhealthy way to have anticipatory grief?
Well,
if you know a loved one's going to die soon or something like that,
I think there are things that we can do. When we say don't worry, we're really taking that away from them, right? We're taking that, we're not validating that emotion that person is feeling. So rather, I would say, let's talk about this. Tell me some stories about this. I think storytelling can be very, very healing and very helpful when we're facing an illness, whether it's us facing the illness or whether we're the caregiver. Sometimes I see a lot of secret keeping. You know, the person who is dying is keeping the secret, don't tell my family, but I'm going to die. And then the family is whispering, saying, don't tell him, but I think he's dying. And so really opening up those lines of communication.
And is there also kind of grief in the pain? Like, I don't want to see them suffer like this. I'm feeling terrible for them because they're going through this.
Of course. And that's part of it. I mean, these circumstances that are out of our control, and if we could take this away, we would do it in an absolute heartbeat. That's the hard part of this. This is where it's not an easy process. Of course, we would want to do that, yet it's sitting in that suffering that is causing that grief.
Okay. What are some like practical strategies that you feel like can help people get through these things and maybe feel more centered and a little bit at peace?
Mm-hmm. One of the things I like to have people do is find a morning kindness ritual. We are so full of shoulding ourselves, you know, I should be over this, I should be feeling this way, I should be better, that we are not kind, we don't, and so find that one thing for you, whether it's waking up 5 minutes early and having your cup of coffee or tea in solitude, reading a little bit of a book, maybe going on a quick walk, whatever it is for you that is going to be kindness for you. Maybe it's sleeping in another 10 minutes. So finding that kindness ritual. The other thing is finding support. We have wonderful resources here in the village. I mean, what are you, 250 some clubs now? And so I know, especially if you're a caregiver, it's not always easy to get out to get involved, but you know, call social services, find ways that you can get involved and connect to other people, not have to isolate yourself.
Right. That self-care is so important. People, I don't have time for that right now. It's like, it's one of the most important things you can do, right?
Absolutely.
And you have to recognize, okay, what is bringing my stress level up? What is it about this? And maybe acknowledge it and speak it out so people can kind of feel it and all those kinds of things. It's important to acknowledge those emotions, right? Like, hey, this is what I'm feeling, and talk to people about it, right? With your community, like you mentioned.
Yes, and talk to people who you're comfortable talking to. Sometimes people don't always give us the greatest responses back, but yes, acknowledging your emotions and trying hard not to label them as good or bad, just this is how I'm feeling today, can actually help you, again, move forward.
How important is it to say what you want to say, to have the conversations, have the kind of make sure there's nothing unresolved before the big moment happens? I
think that's really important. Is talking through these unresolved issues. It's like the bucket list, right? We've talked about the bucket list, and there's I think a movie, the bucket list, and so you know, kind of working through that bucket list and having those important conversations and finishing. Working on that unfinished business. For the person who is ill and is knowing that they will die, I think is very beneficial to help them be at peace.
Yeah, and I think that can be a challenge too if people say, I never got to tell this person this. And then you carry that, right? And that's yet another thing in terms of the process of the grieving, that you, not only on top of the grief, but now you have some guilt, which we don't want to be piling on in this timing.
Right, and when I have people ask me about that, I say it's not too late. They may not physically be here anymore for you to tell them, yet you can write the letter. Write the letter or say the words, you know, find a quiet moment, say the words, tell your story. That's part of that storytelling. Tell your story even if the person isn't physically here with you any longer.
Give yourself some grace in the grief. I get it.
Absolutely.
Becky Lamaka from O'Connor Mortuary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, we're talking about the Aquadettes and their shows coming up. Not the big show, but there are some alternatives. Stay with us.